real dwarves.
Literally no offense to anything. They're very proud to cast a Latino actress as Snow White. It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, but you're still making that backward story of 7 dwarves living in a cave. What the are you doing, man?
This would have been a lot better if they, had a strong male along with her, a prince, if it wasn't about socialism, if they didn't remove the dwarves, if they had...
Because they're not dwarves. For right now, that's the only jobs that are there.
They're remaking the movie. They just got rid of the dwarves. But they have one token dwarf amongst these magical creatures. You actually just went backwards. You actually just erased the dwarfism side of it. The disability, like we're a disability group. You just erased that whole...
From the moment Disney announced a live-action remake of its original 1937 classic, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, fans were both thrilled and anxious. The idea was to breathe fresh life into a beloved fairy tale, modernizing certain elements, while retaining the enchanting core that had captivated generations. Yet, even in those early days, murmurs of doubt surfaced about how exactly this modernization would unfold. Rachel Ziegler's casting as Snow White sparked immediate buzz online. Her supporters praised the move for inclusivity and progress, while critics countered that the heart of the original story might get lost if Disney tampered too aggressively with tradition. Initially, it seemed like this debate would simply revolve around casting. But as the production progressed, it became clear that a far bigger storm was brewing. The turning point arrived when Peter Dinklage, a widely respected actor who consistently speaks out about representation in Hollywood, made a pointed critique. He called Disney's approach fake progressivism, suggesting that while the company was celebrating a more diverse Snow White, it was still retelling a story many felt was outdated, especially when it came to depicting dwarfs as a monolithic group living in the woods. Fans of Dinklage applauded him for challenging a multi-billion-dollar studio to dig deeper into its storytelling, while others argued he was overreacting. Couldn't the dwarf simply be portrayed in a respectful, modern way? Disney found itself in a precarious position, suddenly aware that no matter what they did, someone would accuse them of either clinging to stereotypes or veering too far from the classic fairy tale. Behind the scenes, whispers of frantic rewrites and corporate panic began to leak. Rumors suggested that Dinklage's comments had spooked Disney executives, prompting them to alter the script, even though they were already far into development. Some said entire plot points were upended to distance the narrative from the Seven Dwarfs, replacing them with magical creatures to avoid offense. Almost overnight, the creative team found itself mired in questions about whether beloved aspects of the story would survive the modernization process. Test screenings reportedly confirmed the worst fears. The film felt jumbled, uncertain of its identity, and, most troublingly, unable to strike a satisfying balance between nostalgia and progress. This chaos quickly became public knowledge. Social media users began coining phrases like the Snow White disaster, fueled by both leaked screening feedback and a mounting sense that Disney was struggling to please everyone. In the midst of that firestorm stood Rachel Ziegler. Though initially celebrated for her casting, she found herself labeled the face of a film that was seemingly careening off the rails. The internet dissected every interview she gave, looking for hints of her own views on the dwarf's controversy or her stance on Dinklage's critique. Early on, she maintained a diplomatic front, neither praising nor condemning Disney's choices, in a way that could be turned against her. Meanwhile, Dinklage himself spoke sparingly, reiterating in vague terms that Hollywood should avoid shallow inclusivity in favor of more thoughtful storytelling. Then came the rumor that took on a life of its own, allegations that Rachel Zegler privately blamed Peter Dinklage for throwing the entire project into disarray. Some claimed she felt he had disrupted months of planning, with remarks that Disney scrambled to address too late, creating an identity crisis for the film. Others countered that the blame lay squarely with Disney's knee-jerk reaction. How fair was it to single out one actor's critique, especially an actor who'd consistently championed respectful portrayal of people with dwarfism? Yet the rumor refused to die, and online forums buzzed with speculation. Was Zegler merely venting frustration at a complex situation, or did she truly believe Dinklage had sunk the project by calling out fake progressivism? As the narrative evolved, it became clear that the problem went well beyond casting. Audiences were torn between wanting an updated Snow White that fit modern sensibilities and craving the classic enchantment of the original film. Disney tried to straddle both lines, insisting that its changes were part of a broader mission to keep old tales relevant in a new age. But with each leaked detail, more fans grew skeptical. Test screenings indicated that Disney's attempt to pivot away from the dwarfs while still clinging to the original storyline led to choppy pacing and an overall sense that the film lacked coherence. Critics who learned about the production's patchwork rewrites insisted that such hasty efforts rarely yield a polished product. Meanwhile, Rachel Ziegler, despite appearing graceful in interviews, couldn't escape the growing wave of disapproval. Online detractors argued that by not distancing herself from Disney's decisions, she was tacitly endorsing them. Supporters fired back that she was just an actress fulfilling her contract and had limited power to override the studio. The entire situation spoke to a broader Hollywood issue: how to modernize timeless fairy tales without alienating longtime fans or trivializing the need for genuine inclusivity. Actors with dwarfism added their voices to the discussion. Some sided with Dinklage, stating that the portrayal of the seven dwarfs needed a thoughtful overhaul. Others felt he was being overly cautious, thus depriving actors with dwarfism of significant roles in a high-profile production. Disney, eager to avoid a public relations nightmare, found itself with no safe path forward. Instead, it offered vague statements about wanting to respect all communities while forging a new vision for Snow White. Then came the shocking reports of script rewrites that drastically changed the dwarfs, turning them into an assortment of mythic or magical figures with only one token dwarf among them. For many, that was the final straw. Critics on social media slammed Disney for seemingly erasing an entire community from the story just to dodge controversy. If the aim was respect, some argued, the studio had ended up sending the message that dwarfs themselves were somehow problematic. By the time these details spilled into the public domain, the label Snow White Disaster was firmly attached to the production. People who once championed the idea of a live-action remake began calling it Disney's most catastrophic miscalculation in years. And so, as the buzz escalated, test audience feedback leaked, suggesting that the film felt like a half-finished puzzle. Scenes intended to be heartfelt nods to the original felt forced and cluttered with modern references, while any attempt at deeper commentary on inclusivity felt superficial. Rumors of behind-the-scenes tension abounded. Some creative team members allegedly wanted to remain faithful to the 1937 vision, dwarfs and all, but with an updated sensibility that avoided stereotyping. Others demanded radical changes to distance the story from any potential offense. In the midst of this tug-of-war, those same whispers claimed Rachel Zegler was caught in a vortex, uncertain of how the story would end up once editing was complete. What? About Peter Dinklage during this maelstrom? He shifted his public focus to other projects, rarely referencing Snow White at all. Speculation grew that he was deliberately distancing himself from the Snow White Disaster label, especially as voices from within the dwarfism community began criticizing his stance for eliminating potential roles. Some fans argued it wasn't fair to make him the scapegoat. He was pointing out a problematic trope, not demanding dwarfs be taken out of the story altogether. Yet, the rumor persisted that Zegler believed his high-profile critique had forced Disney to overcompensate, ultimately derailing the film. Her supporters, however, insisted the actress was simply overwhelmed by a barrage of studio demands, fearful that her career would be overshadowed by a disastrous remake. As the release date approached, talk of a second Snow White adaptation started circulating. This reboot, according to the rumor mill, would feature an entirely different creative team, maybe even a different lead actress, with names like Jenna. Ortega floated as possibilities. It was almost as though Disney, sensing an inevitable flop, was already eyeing a way to erase the fiasco with a shinier, less controversial project. For Rachel Zegler, that rumor alone could have felt like a betrayal, suggesting that the studio never truly believed in the film she helped carry on her shoulders. But even a second adaptation wouldn't change what had already been set in motion. Advanced screenings had shown cracks in the project, critics were sharpening their pens, and social media had turned against it. On opening week, the negative. Reviews were brutal. Phrases like tonally inconsistent, confusingly modern, and desperate to avoid controversy filled review headlines. The box office returns were lukewarm at best, nowhere near the triumphant numbers Disney had projected for one of its cornerstone fairy tale properties. Commentators across the internet dissected every element, from costume design to script structure, arguing that the film lacked the cohesive vision needed for a classic remake. Ziegler's performance was called passionate by some, miscast by others, and overshadowed by the overall chaos. Dinklage made no public comment, intensifying speculation that he'd washed his hands of the entire affair. Disney, meanwhile, turned its attention to upcoming releases, hoping the fiasco would die down once the internet fixated on a new target. But the internet does not forget easily, and references to the Snow White disaster kept popping up. Every time discussions turned to whether Disney's live-action strategy was doomed. People argued that modernizing classic fairy tales requires a careful touch, not panicked rewrites and reactionary decisions. The fiasco underscored a deeper cultural tension. How do you honor a piece of film history that's nearly a century old while also updating it to reflect a more inclusive society? If the dwarfs feel problematic, how do you address that in a way that's authentic rather than tokenistic? And if you cast a rising star like Rachel Ziegler, how do you protect her from bearing the brunt of the audience's frustration when controversy erupts? In the end, the rumor that Zegler privately blamed Dinklage for it all became a symbol of a deeper, more convoluted problem. Whether or not she ever voiced such an opinion, the storyline of them being at odds highlighted how easily a single comment, like Dinklage's initial critique, could reverberate through an entire production. At the same time, the fiasco made clear that Disney might have been struggling with or without Dinklage's remarks, given the enormous pressure to modernize a property, so integral to its legacy. The fiasco also sparked conversation about the role of test audiences, whose early feedback can make or break a film. Some wondered whether the film's narrative was ever truly ready for public consumption, or if Disney had rushed it in hopes that nostalgia alone would fill seats. Now that the dust has settled, the Snow White remake stands as a cautionary tale. For Hollywood, wanting to do better does not equate to actually doing better, especially when last-minute changes replace thoughtful planning. It's also a testament to the power and peril of big studios trying to adapt legacy material in an era of heightened social awareness. Rachel Zegler continues to book new roles, attempting to move forward and shake off the label of having led a Disney production that became a lightning rod for criticism. Peter Dinklage remains an influential voice, respected for raising concerns about representation, but also questioned by some who feel his approach inadvertently shut out actors with dwarfism. Disney itself, while never publicly admitting defeat, appears keen to let this version fade and perhaps try again down the line. At its core, the Snow White disaster teaches us that simply casting a diverse lead doesn't shield you from more complex questions of inclusivity, nor does bowing to every external criticism guarantee a graceful, coherent story. Modern. Audiences demand layered, meaningful changes, not a hasty shuffle of longtime characters or knee-jerk script rewrites. If Rachel Zegler did indeed place blame on Peter Dinklage, it may only reflect how desperate the production became to pinpoint the cause of a meltdown that had far more moving parts than just one actor's public remarks. And if the rumor is nothing more than internet chatter, it remains a powerful illustration of how controversies can spiral wildly, overshadowing even the best intentions. Regardless of what actually happened behind the scenes, the fiasco stands as a case study in how not to reimagine a beloved classic. One misstep can trigger a domino effect, rewrites pile onto rewrites, public outrage intensifies, actors get stuck defending a film that no longer resembles what they signed up for, and corporate attempts to minimize damage only amplify it. Disney, eager to preserve the fairy tale magic, ended up exposing just how fragile the line between classic charm and modern realism can be. Snow White may someday rise again in a different adaptation with a different cast, possibly learning from the mistakes that doomed this one. But for now, the memory of a film that could have set new standards for inclusive storytelling remains overshadowed by controversy. If you've stayed with this story until now, it's clear how convoluted the situation became, and how uncertain the answers still are. Did Dinklage's pointed words catalyze a doomed production, or were the cracks already there, just waiting to be revealed? Did Rachel Zegler ever truly blame him, or did a restless internet pin the studio's mistakes on high-profile personalities? There's no tidy conclusion here, but the lessons are plentiful. When remaking a cultural touchstone, having a unified, carefully considered vision from the start is crucial, especially if you're aiming to make that story reflect modern values without losing its enchantment. And that's a feat easier said than done, as the saga of the Snow White disaster makes painfully clear. Ready for more deep dives into Hollywood's biggest missteps and hidden stories? Don't miss out. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you can catch every behind-the-scenes reveal and stay one step ahead of the latest controversies.